אפשר להשם צדיקים יבואו גבול זה.
The weekly portion is called Mishpatim, which means laws. And you guessed it right, the Parsha contains a lot of laws that govern daily life and relationship between people, between people and God. And these laws are a direct continuation of the revelation on Mount Sinai, which we read about last week. So let's start with the beginning and look at the first laws of our portion. And I will read them to you, and I ask you to please listen carefully to the words in English. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. If a male slave came single, he shall live single. If he had a wife, his wife shall live with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall live alone. But if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free, his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain his master's slave for life. And this is Exodus 21, verses 2 to 6. And the next law is on the same subject. When a parent sells a daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as other slaves do. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. And if the master designated her for a son, he shall deal with her as the practice with the free maidens. If he takes another into the household as his wife, he must not withhold from this one her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. If he falls her in these 3 ways, she shall go free without payment. And these are verses 21, 7 to 11. The question is, isn't it interesting that right after the revelation, when God said, I am the Lord who took you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery, the first laws that we read in this Parsha are about owning the slaves. How is it possible that just right after we were liberated from slavery, we were given rules for purchasing and selling slaves? Why we given all these multiple rules instead of just one? You shall not own a slave. The topic of slavery is, of course, very complex, and it caused some discomfort for our sages and modern rabbis, and there are a lot of commentaries and explanations that should help us to navigate this topic. So how can we resolve this issue raised by these laws? We just read in our blessing for new months that God redeemed us from slavery and set us free. So this is the desires to be free. So how can Jews acquire slaves after that? So first common approach to the subject is to say that the laws are trying to make the conditions and status of the slave better. Jewish slave is automatically freed after 6 or sometimes 50 years of slavery. A Jewish female slave must be freed by the master if she is displeasing to him. And in later verses of the same Parsha, we read that a slave should go free if he lost an eye or tooth or was subjected to other serious injuries by his master. And that is described by our commentators as a huge improvement compared to the laws of other nations at that time. Our slaves have rights that are controlled by the judiciary system. They are not things that are owned, but rather they remain human beings. Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch writes in this regard on the subject, God's law, the Torah, wants to instill in us the practice of justice and humanity. and it commanded us to respect human rights. Some other rabbis, such as, for example, Rabbi Bini Friedman, conclude based on these laws that the term slave, with all of its negative connotations, would probably be better replaced by the term indentured servant. Rabbi Shmuel Rabinowitz writes, "Since every person was created in the image of God, a person can never become an object. The inherent holiness of a person is perceived even when he is a slave. And this holiness also led all humanity to adopt the Torah's attitude and abolish slavery." All the commentaries that I found on the subject express the view that our laws were better than other laws. We respected slaves as human beings. We did our best to improve their conditions. It almost sounds like our laws about slavery were a great accomplishment and they were deeply righteous, but it really doesn't sit well with me. The best way to respect human beings as created in the image of God is not to enslave them. The best way to improve their conditions is to set them free. The best law about slavery is to rule that slavery is prohibited. In my eyes, there can be no justification of slavery, and that is why apologetic commentaries make me very uncomfortable. Torah did not say indentured servant, it said a slave. One should not change the words only because they make him uncomfortable. We have to embrace the truth. These were not humane laws. They were better than some others, but that doesn't mean that they were just. Yes, the Hebrew slave would go free in 6 years, but his wife and children would not. And the only way for him to stay with his family was to submit himself to indefinite slavery. And that was done through a humiliating procedure of leaving a physical mark on the body of an enslaved person by piercing his ear. Imagine yourself in this situation. Is that a free choice? Holding a family of a slave hostage to make him remain a slave forever? What would you do in this situation? Would you leave your family as slaves and go free, or would you stay? And what do you think about selling your daughter as a slave? You have this option. And the fact that is kind of, it always goes unnoticed in all these commentaries, that she was not freed in 6 years. She was bound to slavery indefinitely. Yes, there are certain conditions under which the girl who was sold into slavery by her parents could go free if the master found her displeasing, or if he was withheld from her food, clothing, or her conjugal rights. But remember that even a free woman could not be a witness in the court, even today in certain circles of Jewish practices. Slaves could not be witnesses. So imagine how impossible that would be for a slave girl to prove in court that her rights were violated. Torah doesn't prohibit beating slaves. The punishment comes only if the master kills a slave. But again, imagine bringing this case to the court. Who would accuse the master of killing a slave? And who could prove it, and how? And remember that unlike Eved Ivri, a Hebrew slave, the Eved Knani, Canaanite slave, that is to say a slave that was captured during the war, does not go free after 6 years or at the Jubilee. Under normal circumstances, he serves forever, according to the written Torah. The truth is very bitter. Slavery is slavery. It is not a servitude. And Israelites, they were not against slavery. They just didn't want to be slaves themselves. Another approach taken by rabbis to ease this topic is to say that slavery was an inescapable reality of those times. It was so widespread that the world without slavery was simply unimaginable, which is why these laws defined the responsibilities of slave owners, but did not abolish slavery. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and treat your slaves better than you were treated. That is true. The laws of the slavery and the Torah were given in a specific historical context where slavery was a common occurrence, but idolatry was a common occurrence as well. Yet Jews were able to imagine the world with only one God. Human sacrifices were a common occurrence, but they were prohibited by God. Torah is full of revolutionary laws that challenge common occurrences and made unimaginable real. Yet slavery was not prohibited. The last argument that I want to present to you is that these laws are not prescriptive, meaning they don't require and endorse slavery. It doesn't command you own a slave, but rather they seek to regulate and mitigate the harm done by an already existing system of a slavery. This is unfortunately far from reality. So February is Black History Month. It would really violate my moral standards to say that these laws did not endorse slavery when we know that they were widely used by theologians to support the practice of slavery in modern times. You may say that these were Christian theologians, not Jews, except that Jews also owned slaves. They owned slaves in ancient times and also took part in the transatlantic slave trade, selling slaves and benefiting from it. And that all was easily backed up by the Torah, which shows examples proving that slavery was common among the Israelites. I would like to, really point out and to clarify that I don't endorse the false anti-Semitic accusation of Jews playing the central role in African slave trade. That is an evil and really hurtful accusation, and that should always be condemned. But in order to be able to speak about it, we should be properly educated, and education always begins with owning the truth. We all know that there were many prominent abolitionists among Jews, but there were Jews who were pro-slavery. The most noticeable example is a debate between Rabbi Morris Jacob Raphael and Rabbi David Einhorn. I will not retell you the whole debate because it's quite long, but I encourage you to Google it and to read it after Shabbat in honor of Black History Month. There is a wonderful article. It's called Noah's Curse on the Eve of the Civil War. A rabbi declares black slavery biblical, and it's published on the website thetorah.com. So you can read it later after Shabbat. On January 4th, 1861, Rabbi Morris Jacob Raphael preached a sermon just like I'm preaching to you today, which was called Bible View of Slavery. Kind of the same topic that I'm doing right now. And his sermon would reverberate across the United States. He argued 3 key points. First, the black slaves were descendants of Ham and were cursed by Noah to be slaves. Second, Bible treated the enslaved as a species of lawful property. He noted that the 10th commandment placed an enslaved person in the same category as an animal. You shall not want your neighbor's wife. Likewise, none of you shall crave your neighbor's house or field, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Moreover, he says, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Job, men who God connects with his own most holy name, all possessed slaves. And third point, he claimed that Canaanite slaves, those who did not go free, were analogous to the southern black slaves. Bound by the laws of Leviticus, they were an inheritance. And this is a sermon of a rabbi. This is a sermon that was widely distributed and discussed, and the reaction in some quarters were really electric. Rabbi David Einhorn, a leader of the Reform movement, responded to Rafal from his pulpit at Har Sinai Temple in Baltimore. And that was, of course, a slave state of Maryland. And he also published an article in his journal Sinai, where he argues against the points that Rafal brought. 2 months after he gave his response, Einhorn fled Baltimore ahead of an angry mob. That was not received well, what he said. And that teaches us really that we should be very, very careful with using Torah to back up our political views. Because if we are smart enough, we can, twist it in a way that we can prove anything we want. We can prove that slavery is great, and this is what God wanted, and we, of course, can prove that slavery was not the ideal of Israelites. So this is our history, and I believe that there is no more appropriate time to speak about it than Black History Month, because this is a special time designated in our calendar to reflect on the complex and unsettling questions. And instead of renaming slavery as indentured servitude and avoiding discomfort altogether, we should own our history and speak about it without fear, because that is the only way to improve the world. I believe that there is no need to be overly apologetic and to claim that we were more righteous by giving slaves some rights, or that it was our laws that led to the abolishment of slavery. For slavery existed for thousands of years after the revelation on Mount Sinai. Well, as a good rabbi, I should conclude my sermon with some positive message. Yes, we went a long way, and we can say that the laws regarding slaves in Parashat Mishpatim were an improvement in the rights of the enslaved population. And I agree that the laws of the Torah were intended to build a more just society, and that the ethical imperative is the main driver of our laws. But I don't want to make it too soft, for it may cloud our judgment. The best thing I can recommend to you is to tune in to the online program led by our executive director, Rivka Campbell, From the Inquisition to the Caribbean, the Jews of Jamaica, tomorrow, Sunday, February 18th at 3 p.m., of course for free. You can find the information in the last page of your Manishma, right here in the blue box. So show her your love and support of Black History Month. And I think this is the best thing we can do. Open our hearts and minds to education and be brave to face difficult questions with the righteous intentions to make our world a better place. Shabbat Shalom.